Alrighty. Let's make sure we are up here first. Yep, looks like it. Alrighty. So, sorry about that for anyone who was watching the live stream earlier. I had some technical difficulties that I thought would potentially happen because I was streaming outside. I've never streamed outside before. And our internet connection has kind of been sketchy outside, I would say, beforehand. But thanks for watching now, if you are watching. And again, I apologize for that. I thought it was worth a try just to try it out, because I do, like I said, it was so beautiful outside. So why not give it a try? And yes, I am back, John. And we shouldn't have any problems now since I'm back inside and all set up. So, as I said earlier, I'm probably going to take off the other stream and keep this one. So I do want this one to include some of the elements that I had from my last one for anybody who stumbles upon it later. So there's not all this craziness around it. So I'm just going to briefly summarize what I said in like the first 25 minutes of the last live stream. So I am making a medieval book that was a former horror story that I wrote in college with my English professor. And the horror story had a lot of components you had to include in it because it was a college paper. And it had to be 10 pages, had to be horror, had to be this. But I was very interested in history as a person. I've always kind of been interested in history. And I wanted to write it and set the story in medieval times. So I decided that I was going to set it in medieval times. And I wrote the story, and I was very, very happy with the story. So I decided that I was going to kind of make this into a story. And if you didn't watch my first live stream, that's where I read out all 10 pages of my book or of my short story at that point. It kind of theorized what I plan to do so far. And I kind of have two running ideas. One running idea was thought up by John, so I'll give him credit from that. And my other idea was kind of what I was thinking of doing with the story. So I'm going to talk briefly about those two ideas and what I have done. And I made a checklist from my last interpretation from my last live stream and what I needed to do. And my checklist was work on those two ideas, research burial in medieval times, like what it was it anything different than what we do now, and if it was, what was the difference, those type of things. And then I wanted to explore this program, what you see in front of you, and obviously I bought this program and to keep myself organized, because I do very much need to be organized in order to keep going. So I'm going to briefly run through all of my characters that I did in the first stream before it all got deleted due to bad connection outside. So Sir William Kane is the head of the Queen's Guard, and he's introduced very early on in the story, well, halfway point, but early on into the next part of the story. And Sir William Kane is in charge of the Queen's Guard and holds a very authoritative position from the novel's perspective immediately when you meet him. Sir Jester, you don't know much about what he does or who he is, but we know that he's in charge of the defense of this unknown empire. And so I kind of have two working empires in my story. I have the unknown empire, which is obviously we don't know anything about it. That's why I have unknown. Woo! Wow, fancy. And then I have the fallen Roman Empire. And the reason it's the fallen Roman Empire is because it is written after the fall of the Roman Empire. Woo! I know. Creative names. Anyway, so I'm setting my novel just after the Roman Empire really collapsed on itself. But obviously it still exists in some parts. Then you have Catherine. And depending on which idea I end up going with, Catherine is going to play a huge role in the story. She's either going to be one of the major characters or one of the very big minor characters, Archie is going to be the main character of the story. And she's kind of the caretaker, but she has a slight twist to her that kind of makes us not really trust her. And I kind of want her to be like a female Littlefinger for the Game of Thrones books. Then I have the unknown. Well, they're kind of unknown, but unnamed soldiers. And those are basically, the reason I put that in as characters in the first place was just because I wanted to make sure that I included like what the mass soldier perspective would be. And a mass soldier at the time would obviously be greedy and loud and kind of destructive. So I kind of included that in my story. So these soldiers aren't any different than what the average medieval soldier probably was. Then we have Sir Felix, and Sir Felix was kind of a very high positioned person, and you kind of thought from the way the story started that he was going to be the main character, but he gets killed off very early and gives a message to Page Vetus that to continue on the mission, even though we don't know what the mission is quite yet. And those who don't know, the Page is under a knight, and essentially he works for the knight, but he's not quite a squire, because a squire is the position above a page. So it's kind of a lower level position, but you're still working with the knight. So you're not just like an average soldier. A page does have some respect. And again, depending on which idea I choose, Page Vetus is going to be either a major character or the kind of a lesser known character throughout the entire story. And you'll kind of understand why as I continue on with my stream and later on. Then you have Avacus Henry. And real quick, a Avacus is someone who was a former criminal that goes into the army and serves out his sentence through that, gets released, but decides to come back. So I wanted to include different components to what the average soldier or average army would have in my story. So I didn't just want it to be boring those soldiers every single time. Then you have Lord Dominica, and I don't have very much about Lord Dominica or what he looks like or anything, because I haven't really thought of the character fully. And I might even have Lord Dominica as a former lord and not Lord Dominica as in living now, because he is quoted for saying the phrase in my story, "For I, the Knight of Rome, will and shall not be afraid." Then you have a lead Atticus, and lead Atticus, or Legate Atticus, is essentially in charge of one sector of the army or one component of the army, because the armies, especially in the Roman Empire, even after the fall, were so big, and especially during when the Roman Empire was so huge, you would have different legates, and they controlled the head of that would be the person running that sector of the army. And so he is one of those people. And as I'll describe a little bit later, he's kind of going to play a huge role in the next components of the story. Then I have General Pius. And General Pius, I kind of want to be based off of Caesar and what he did in the past, even though I don't want it to be an exact carbon copy of who Caesar was, because that's kind of boring. And I do want to change some things, but I want his presence to be very much Caesar-like. And then I'm going to run through my timeline real quick, as this feature does have a timeline within the Campfire program. So in black here is the events of the fallen Roman Empire, and in purple is the events of the unknown empire. So at the start of my story, I started off with Sir Felix having a monologue and kind of talking about the poor situation they are in. And then he later gets killed along with Avacus Henry during the actual war, as you see here. And when I click on it, I can give it the description. But I'm just going to briefly run through each one and not just go over the full details for each thing. So he dies, and Page Vetus ends up getting an arrow through his shoulder. gets an arrow through his shoulder and faints by a tree and gets picked up, but he wakes up in an unknown room, and that's the first introduction to the unknown empire, and we don't really know too much about it. The only thing we really know is the sigil and how different the people looked through Catherine, who was the main caretaker of the row. But then Sir William Kane comes barging in with some soldiers and demands to search the room, but the soldiers end up getting distracted and don't find the person who was hiding, or gets thrown off the bed more like, and decide to get the gold. But Catherine re-enters the room, and something's different about her. She has blood going through her eyes, and blood falling out of one of her eyes, and she looks like she just got beaten, and she did just get beaten, even though it was off screen or off the story from that perspective. But the soldier, Page Fetus, is someone concerned about what he should do, but he decides to trust her because she has only been nice so far. And depending on which idea I do, you'll see what's going to happen real short. But she either helps him or kills him, essentially. And you'll see, depending on what option I choose, which one I'm going to go on from now on with my two ideas. But essentially, I want Catherine to be that mischievous character, that somebody you can't really identify as being good or bad, kind of the gray area character. And like I've already said, or I might have said on my first stream earlier today, and not the first stream I did of the book series, but anyway, you get what I'm saying. That I kind of want to see her based off of like Littlefinger from the story. And obviously I plan to use this app I got a whole lot more in actually building a ward, because I have a ward building pack, and I can start religions and systems and magic if I want to include magic, which I might include a little bit of magic, but it would be kind of based off of what the medieval people would believe magic was, or what they would consider magic as being, and not necessarily like a Game of Thrones edition of having Melisandre with the fire god, or dragons as a whole. And again, I keep saying as a whole. Anyway. So, now we have caught up. We are at the part where I stopped the first stream, and now you can start listening, John. No, I'm joking. Anyway. So as I was saying, I'm thinking of building my first castle idea off of Dover Castle, and John suggested another castle, which I should have wrote down, but I was too distracted by trying to figure out the buffering situation on the first earlier stream. And thank you, John, for catching it as I was focused on talking my ideas out. But essentially, Dover Castle was in a very strategic location. Those that know anything about military defense, or anything kind of based off of military and tactics, either do video games or do research in history, you know that being higher up is better off. Kind of like in the American Revolution when you had the Battle of Bunker Hill and all these other battles. If you have the higher ground, the chances are that you're at a better advantage of killing the soldiers aiming down instead of having to run up and aim up. So any perspective where you are higher than your opponent is better. And that's where Dover Castle is, as it is built on top of a hill. But not only is it built on top of a hill, behind it is an ocean, and they have the only access through a port to that ocean. So they had a very strong navy and first line of protection for that castle and everything within. So it was a very strategic position and strategic hold point for people, or for the empire. In this case, it was Britain. And I was reading this History Extra article where it talked about how the defenses were, and that King Henry VIII was the one who built a lot of extra defense, but really building this castle up. but there is still a watchtower today where if you were to visit Dover Castle that the Romans built, that they were able to overlook the seas and control the seaport when the Romans had access to the castle. And sorry if I keep looking back. I'm trying a different strategy than my first stream, as I'm actually showing my screen this time, where I have another screen up here which shows the comment section. I don't want to miss you guys' comments, but as the streams go on and as I get more used to it, I'll get a little better with that. But essentially, this article was also talking about some of the defenses it had, along with a watchtower. It had massive walls and had a ton of crossbows along the walls and on the castle where any defense would happen. And hey, Ed, I'm building a novel that was a former writing project for an English horror 10-page short story. So I'm building it into a medieval fantasy novel, and it's more of a low fantasy novel because I'm not making it like super Game of Thronesy, where there's a lot of dragons and fire gods and all these other crazy ideas. I more want it to be realistic but still have some fantasy components because, as I've said numerous times, I'm not trying to write a history book. So I was kind of thinking of basing my castle off of the Dover and its historic relevance, because as I said on my first stream, I want to take a castle what actually existed and use it. Maybe beef it up a little bit, add a little bit of extra things, because everybody kind of wants to see a little extra, a little bigger, especially when it comes to castles in the fantasy genre. But I don't necessarily want to go full-blown with beefing up the castle because I think that that is semi-unrealistic. And I'm not really going for super unrealistic, as I think it's more interesting to base it off of a castle that actually existed compared to a completely made-up idea. But as I was doing my research, as I mentioned with my checklist at the beginning of the stream, I first wanted to look up the burial rites and kind of what happened in the medieval period and medieval times to make sure that there wasn't anything super crazy that they did compared to nowadays. And essentially, if you were a criminal, the only thing that really happened different was you were buried in a separate area, and that separate area was called execution cemeteries. But as the medieval time went on, those execution cemeteries kind of dissolved because they had so many bodies and didn't really care to really isolate these people as much as they would in the past. But I might use the idea of execution cemeteries in my novel as well. But through my research and other articles that I didn't really want to write paragraphs about because it wasn't exactly important to it. I don't know the words for it, but it doesn't need to. Long story short, there wasn't as much of a difference as I thought there would be. So with the burial rites, I'm going to kind of brainstorm a little bit more in exactly what I plan to do with it. But I don't think that it's going to be super crazy because in the medieval times, they didn't really do super crazy when it comes to those things. And this was just a castle of Dover with the EnglishHeritage.org. That was kind of the first website I visited for basing off of real castles, because I did a lot of Google searches like Roman castles, medieval castles, greatest castles of all time. You know, all these Google random searches to kind of, and catchy, clickbaity type of ideas to try to get Google to generate list, so to speak, of castles that I could base off my novel for being. And I know that these words are spelled incorrectly. Somebody's probably going to point that out. So this was my story here, and obviously you're not going to be able to read it because I'm flying through the pages, but it was the Trails of Rome. It was 10 pages long, and it ended in an interesting part that I had to think about how I was going to continue it. because so far I haven't really added anything to my original story that I wrote for my English project. But throughout this last week, I was kind of brainstorming ideas. I didn't get as far as I would have liked in my brainstorming the ideas, but I did kind of write a few sentences that I did want to keep or at least adjust a little bit because I think they have promise to them. And I kind of brainstormed the rest of the chapter, or at least the rest of the part of the chapter, to base it off of. And I'm about to get into the two ideas I had. One being John's idea he had on my first live stream of this, and a second being idea I originally had for my novel. Quick drink break. Gotta have some iced tea in the South. Anyway, as John says, the Brunarati, I probably butchered that, castle is a beautiful Norman style castle. Yeah, I'll have to make sure I write that down. I'll write that down now, just so I don't forget. As obviously, I'm not just going to have two empires in my story, or what I say, obviously. It might not be, obviously, for you, because you don't know what's inside my head. But I kind of want there to be more than just two empires or two castles, and because that's a very centralized story, which could be interesting, but I don't think it really is the way I want to go, or the way I think it should go. So I plan to have many empires and many castles, so I can base another empire off that castle, or even combine a couple empires with different castles. I have freedom to do that, as it's obviously not a history book. So I have theme 2 and theme 1, and I just wrote those in to I copy and pasted my story and had the two ideas. So the first idea, or what I call theme 1, really I should change that to idea 1. Yeah, I'm going to do that. I don't know why I said theme 1. Let me change that. I didn't really think about that till I read that out loud. Anyway, so the idea 1 is essentially what I wrote would stay fully intact, even the end, as I'll slowly scroll down to the end here. And if you're interested in hearing my story, you can go to my first live stream called Writer's Block, and has a pen to paper thumbnail it has a pen to paper thumbnail, and you can find it in my videos in my YouTube channel, obviously. Whew, I don't know why that was so hard to say or think. Anyway, so my first idea is keeping the 10 pages I wrote fully, maybe adding to them a little bit, but having that as my prologue. And this was John's idea, so keeping it intact and having it as a prologue, maybe adding something, but not completely certain. And then keep starting off my novel with a different idea. Or starting off my novel with something different, as obviously it's a prologue. It's not the continuation of the story right into chapter 1, if that makes any sense. It makes sense in my head, but I'm not sure I explained it super well. But those what know what a prologue is, or have experience in reading books, kind of know what I'm trying to say, even though I can't really say it. So I would start it off with chapter 1 and not continuing the story through the prologue. Anyway, so I was trying to think where I should start it. As obviously, if I were to do this prologue version and kill Page Vetus, he no longer exists. He's dead. He's gone. He's over. So he's no longer a character I can play around with, which is fine. I'm okay with that. It's actually would be a really, really good prologue, because I'm very happy with the story I wrote and with that being a prologue. So I was thinking, where should I start this novel, and I decided, well, Catherine is now going to be the main character, or at least one of the main characters in my story. So how can I introduce Catherine after the prologue? Because in the prologue, she seems very evil, and really she might be the villain of the story, and I'm kind of leaning that direction. As I've already said, I kind of want her to be a Littlefinger-like character, where some people could think that she's doing, her motivations are good and her motivations are just and her motivations are strong, whatever catchy word you want to use for something good. Others might take the same thing you read and think that those motivations are something that is wrong and something you shouldn't do. So I want her to be a very gray area character, and that's important. So I decided that I would start it off in the unknown empire. And so obviously I would have to give that empire a name. I don't want to just keep calling it the unknown empire. And I haven't thought of a name yet, but it's something I would need to do if I decide to keep on with idea 1. So I'm just going to read what I have written with my 2 sentences. And those... my first pages in my story, my first 10 pages in my story were extremely detailed and used a lot of adjectives and a lot of words. I'm not sure exactly what you want to call it, but it was very intense read and very interesting. And that took me a while to do, and I'm very proud of it, as I've already said. So these sentences, although they're kind of vague, I'm going to have to go back and change them to add that same word tone into it. But I kind of wanted to just put a sentence down to get my mind going, and this is what I had. The summer sunrise hits the northeast castle wall, casting an ominous shadow even the greatest enemy would be afraid of. The poor and the wise were the only ones awake, although they lived very different lives. So that's what I had for my first 2 sentences so far. And as I've said, I wanted to get more done, but unfortunately, I couldn't really think of ideas, and I just decided, go ahead and write a sentence. Go ahead and just see if you can get your mind going and just kind of think. Just write. Don't worry about putting in all these adjectives. Don't worry about all of these other things. You can come back and do that. And that's something I want to come back and do. So that's what I did. And I was able to kind of think of those 2 sentences. And then I'm like, okay, let's think about what I want to include in the rest of the chapter before I just keep writing and make the story not really connect with each other. Because you have to think about these things even in the first chapter or and all these other things, because if you don't, your book is going to seem very not jointed and kind of confusing. So I decided that my next steps to kind of brainstorming my first idea in my first chapter would be this. First off, I want to describe the poor. As I just mentioned, the poor and the wise were the only ones awake. So I want to mention the poor and kind of describe what being poor was like in that unknown empire. Excuse me. So I want to describe what their living situation was like, and I also want to describe what the poor were doing because they were awake. So what were they doing? And then I want to compare that to the rich and to the wealthy lifestyle of that empire. And then I want to mention Catherine, who would be the main character or one of the main characters of the name, but I don't want her to be shown in the story yet. So in other words, I want to mention her by name, but not have her in the story yet. That's how I first want to introduce Catherine after the prologue. I want her to kind of be that character that people know about and they don't know what to think of her, or they feel like they have her down and they know who she is and what she is, but they don't exactly, but they're wrong. And then I want to introduce Sir William and Sir Jester, and I put under that head of the Queen's Guard to remind me just in case and not confuse the two. With Sir William being the head of the Queen's Guard, I want to include an example within there where he comes across as very demanding and knows what he wants, and leading his soldiers, maybe having them train or something within that as an example to beef up the strategy, or to beef up that character as being someone who's very strong and strong-minded and has it's his way or the highway type of attitude. Then I have Sir Jester talks with soldiers for next defense plan. So I mentioned in my character tab of my campfire program what I showed you first, and I'm not sure if I read it or if I read it in my first stream, because as I mentioned, my first stream had some technical problems due to being outside. My first stream today, not the first overall stream. Anyway, so I'll say it again. Basically, Sir Jester is only mentioned by name in the prologue or in chapter 1, depending on which idea, but let's use the terminology for this idea. In the prologue, and I want to first introduce him as that person who's making a defense plan or acting on the defense plan he's made, because that's what his role is, and I want him to kind of be shown strongly in that role at first. I kind of want you to leave this empire after chapter 1, or think of this empire after reading chapter 1 and saying they kind of know what they're doing as a place. And then I want to introduce Catherine fully in the story by like having her speak and having her actions. And first thing I want to have her do and have the reader see her do, if that makes sense, is having her walk through the dungeons. And I'm not sure exactly what I want to do with this, but I kind of want to create a ominous tone from within her introduction again. Although you already get that from the prologue, I feel like that would be a way to continue Catherine's tone for the story through her first introduction. Because why would she be walking through the dungeons? What is her motive? What exactly is she doing? And that questions are what I want the reader to leave with in chapter 1. You know she has a plan, but you don't know what her plan is yet. So that's kind of what I have so far for my idea 1, or chapter 1. And my running title for chapter 1 so far is 375 AD, The Darkness Continues. So 375 AD is when the fall of the Roman Empire occurred. Obviously, that's a whole year, not the exact month, but you kind of get what I'm going with here. And it's to introduce the new empire, or the unknown empire, from the story and not the Roman Empire right away. And I might add dates for every chapter, like say 376 AD, blank, 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 or 380 AD, blank, blank, blank. But I'm not sure if that's going to be something I'm going to do or not, because it's still kind of early on. But I felt like I needed it for the first chapter to set the tone of the story again, just to make sure that the reader and the audience knows what's going on. I don't want to pound it in over and over and over to the point where the audience goes, I get it, I know. But I still want them to understand where it's being set, even in chapter 1. So I'm interested to see what John, or if Ed's still here, or if anyone else who's watching thinks of that first idea, or what I plan to do to continue my story, especially if you listen to my first live stream of this novel series where I read out all of the 10 pages. But that's kind of what I was thinking for chapter 1 of this idea and the first introduction to the story besides the prologue. But I obviously have theme 2, or idea 2, and I'm going to change that to idea. Alrighty. So obviously, idea 2 continues on the story. So instead of the story I read in the first stream, ending and being a prologue, I continue the story and have it as a chapter. So that is my idea too. So I was trying to think, well, where do I want to go with this idea if I were to continue the story? But first I had to figure out how I was going to change that last paragraph in order to not have him die. Because obviously when I wrote, or not obvious, well, anyway, when I wrote the horse story, I wanted it to end with a death. But this isn't a horror story anymore, although I could have components of horror from within my story. So what I decided to do was this, and I think I'm going to change it a little bit and add some more adjectives and some more language, because the way I write is I'll write real simple sentence, and then I'll come back and change it and make it a little bit better, and then I'll come back and look at it again and really add those adjectives and beef up the sentence. So it takes me a couple times to write the language of the story and how I want it to sound and how I want it to be. Because my idea doesn't just come up right away. The adjective doesn't just go, whoop, there it is, whoop, here, add. It takes me a little bit of time. So right here it has, she plunges the dagger into his chest. As it penetrates the breastplate from where it lay, Catherine quickly pressed her fingers over my grimacing face. So I have it end that part of the paragraph that way. And I was trying to think before I started this stream and to add some sentences, and I was just getting kind of stuck to kind of decide what I wanted to do and how the chapter would continue. So like I mentioned in the first idea, I'm like, okay, let me plan out the rest of the chapter and let's figure out how to attach the web from what that is to the chapter, what I have. So it's kind of similar to the idea one a little bit, but it's a little different because it's a different idea. I mean, obviously, I keep saying obviously now. Anyway, so for this idea, I have Catherine go to the poor of the city. So go to the poor of the city, have Catherine search for a vulnerable boy. So essentially my idea of this was either having her or one of her henchmen, if she does have henchmen, go into the poor area of the city or of the castle and search for a vulnerable boy. If I have Catherine do it, which I might do, and I think I'm going to do, because I don't really see her as having henchmen. Littlefinger in Game of Thrones had his whores and prostitutes essentially as his spies and his henchmen in Game of Thrones. I plan to do something similar with Catherine, but not really in that way. And I don't really want her to have henchmen like soldiers. You know, that's kind of cliche in my opinion. So I'm not really sure what her henchmen will be. But I kind of don't want her to be a loner character as well. So as of now, in my idea, I plan to have Catherine do the search. But that might change when I start putting pen to paper with writing this chapter. So have Catherine search for a vulnerable boy, pay him / his family for silence, bring him to the castle, and prepare. And what I mean by prepare is what I plan on doing with the rest of the chapter is essentially have this boy who looks similar to Page Fetus be Page Fetus, and he ends up getting killed by Catherine instead of Page Fetus. And then Catherine later plans to escape with Page Fetus, so Page Fetus leaves that unknown empire. But Catherine still killed the boy, and that's how I plan to kind of keep her gray. Although she frees the main character of the story, she killed a poor person in place of that character. And I felt like it was a good way to kind of keep her character in a gray area where you're not really sure if she's good or if she's bad. So that's kind of the running idea I had, and that's why I kind of searched burial rites or burial customs in the medieval times so that I could continue the idea and have him die and get buried like Page Vetus would have been but it wasn't Page Fetus, and it was just some random poor boy who got paid to die, essentially. So those are the two ideas I had. And as I added in the description, or at least it should be in the description, or if you're watching now, I was wondering, just out of curiosity, which idea you kind of liked better. Not that I'm necessarily going to go with it fully, because like I mentioned in my first stream, I plan to write each idea out fully and kind of see which one I like better. I don't plan to keep writing 2 stories, because that's a lot to write 2 whole novels with 2 different ideas. That's not exactly what I'm doing, but I do want to see which idea turns into the better story and which makes more sense and is more compelling to read. So I was wondering which idea you kind of liked better. They are similar in some ways because I kind of have a overlying plot in the book and in the story and what I want to have in it throughout both ideas. Because again, I do have a idea of the book as the picture, and not just as pieces of the picture, like it seems like I might have, because it is in a very early stage of the process. So this is where I get to my last part and why I called it research in the second part of the title. But I'm going to take a quick drink real quick. Okay. Alrighty. So I wanted to research a little bit of the Middle Ages as a whole, or the medieval times. I keep saying as a whole. Anyway, in the medieval times, so I'm not going to spend a crazy amount of time because, as I mentioned, I don't want to keep repeating myself. I did try to stream outside today, and it didn't really work entirely, but I don't have a whole lot of extra time to continue the stream as I would have liked, and as I wanted to have to kind of really share the idea and what I plan to do next, so that next Monday I'll actually have some content, hopefully, to read, and you'll really get to kind of get my full idea of the story. But I wanted to research just a little bit about the medieval times. So I found this part to be real interesting, and I think I knew about it, but I wasn't entirely sure the mass effect it had for the medieval times. But as I read, after the fall of Rome, no single state or government united the people who lived on the European continent. Instead, the Catholic Church became the most powerful institution of the medieval period. Kings and queens and other leaders derived much of their power from their alliance with and the protection of the Church. In 800 CE, for example, Pope Leo III named the Frankish king Charlemagne, I butchered that, the Emperor of the Romans, the first that empires fall more than 300 years before. Over time, Charlemagne's remain. I know I've heard of that, and I know how I know to pronounce it. I just can't right now. Rome became the Holy Roman Empire, one of several political entities in Europe whose interests tended to align with those of the Church. Ordinary people across Europe had to tithe 10% of their earnings each year to the Church at the same time. The Church was mostly exempt from taxation. These policies helped to amass a great deal of money and power. And then it talks about the rise of Islam as a religion compared to Christianity and, most importantly, Catholicism in the medieval times. So I kind of knew that the Catholic Church was big during the time, but I didn't know it was as big as History.com makes it sound, or as big as it really was. Not that I trust History.com fully, as I kind of don't trust History.com fully, due to their ancient aliens and all these other conspiracy channels they have on their television network. But I do know that the Catholicism was very big. So I decided to think that I need to use religion in my story as well. And I plan to use religion in my story, but I kind of need to brainstorm ideas of religion. Yes, I might take an actual religion, but I do plan to do kind of what Game of Thrones and a lot of other fantasy novels do, and that's also kind of make up a religion that is based on several religions kind of combined into one. So that is kind of my running idea I have for that and what I got out of that article from there. But then I wanted to, since both of my ideas kind of included peasants and poor people of the medieval times, since the Catholic Church since I wanted to include, I keep thinking Catholic Church. Anyway, the Catholic Church had a very strong impact, and although they existed and religion existed, I do plan to use Catholicism in the book with the Roman Empire, but I also plan, like I said, to create kind of my own religion, so to speak, and I do also plan to include Islamic religion into the story as well, because like I said, I want to make the story kind of based off of history and based off of what actually happened, but still have fantasy components. So I knew I needed to do more research on peasants and what life particularly was like in the medieval times. And John says, the Catholic Church was the most powerful institution in the medieval era. And yeah, so History.com is right in that. And obviously History.com did have a good reputation at one point. I was even going to do a video on History channel and what happened to it and kind of how it started. But it's kind of hard to find research on what first got included in History channel. So it was kind of a hard video to make. And at the time I was doing other things in school, high school. And but I might actually make that video now, not because I really have more time, but because it's still interesting to me, especially since I keep doing research on history. So I went to medievaltimes.com, which was suggested to me by a Discord friend who also is very big on history like John is, and I do plan on using John, so if you're listening, John, plan to see a couple DMs here pretty soon about actual history and actual life in the medieval times, because John is very good with history and in the medieval time period, and I'm still doing a lot of research and still brushing myself up on those times. I do think I have a relatively good understanding of what the medieval times was like, but obviously it could grow more. So, as I read, peasants were the poorest people in the medieval era and lived primarily in the country or small villages. Serfs were the poorest of the peasant class and were a type of slave. Lords owned the serfs who lived on their lands. In exchange for a place to live, serfs worked the land to grow crops for themselves and their lord. In addition, serfs were expected to work their farms for the lord and pay rent. Everyday peasants could be abducted and marry if they couldn't afford it. Serfs, however, could not either and were not permitted to relocate without the lord's approval. Farmers were a bit better off than peasants, as some owned their own farms. Most worked farmlands themselves or with the aid of peasants and serfs. Farmers and peasants lived simple dwellings called cottages. They built their own homes from wood, and the roofs were thatched, made of bundles of needs that had to be replaced periodically. The inner walls were generally made of wattle and daub. An arrangement are twigs weaved into a well shape and coated with muddage and straw to make a hard plaster-like surface to keep out drafts. Often farmers, peasants, and serfs brought their animals into their homes to protect them. as I read from John. Contact me anytime. I'll answer as soon as I can. Sweet. I like that. Now we'll read a little bit about tradesmen. Carpenters were highly skilled and considered to be an elite tradesman to become a carpenter. Am I reading? Yeah. It was usually necessary to join a guild as an apprentice and learn the craft. A knowledge of math, woodworking, and use of tools was required for all carpenters. Queen and nobles often sought the finest carpenters and kept them retained on their staffs as specialists. Furnishing cattle and estates was not only done for decorative purposes, but also to demonstrate prestige and status to visitors. Thus, a master carpenter was always in demand and could earn high wages. The metalsmith, sometimes called blacksmith, had to make his tools before he would make metal parts, such as horseshoes, nails, and door hinges. The blacksmith would also work as an armory for the queen or count, making swords, shields, and armor. Civilians of the Middle Ages. And I see a comment here. John says that is incorrect. When it says serfs couldn't marry, they could. And in fact, it was one of the two ways a serf became a free person. Okay. That is good to know. I thought there was a structure like that. I wouldn't say I knew that for a fact or really had much understanding of that. But I did think that there was a way that a slave in the medieval times would become a civilian through means of something. And I wasn't sure if it was through marriage, although a lot of times in history it was through marriage. So obviously if you asked me that a couple hours ago, I probably would have said it was something else besides marriage. But marriage is oftenly a common thing in history, or at least I found in history, to gain status. So that does make sense that a serf would become a peasant or gain status through marriage. Civilians of the Middle Ages. The Roman Empire was in decline and being invaded by many tribes in the 3rd and 4th and 5th centuries. That's a lot of time. These tribes waged battles and war to establish new territories and kingdoms, where the leaders were always heroes of battles for land. New waves of invasions took place in early 9th century by tribes not previously known to invade European lands. Below is a list of 8 key tribes of the period. I cannot read. Angles, Saxons, Jutes, and Frisians invaded England. I need to practice these words here. This is the root of the term Anglo-Saxon. Yeah, I knew the Anglo-Saxon, which is often used to describe English peoples. As John says, yeah, if a serf marries a free person, then the serf becomes free as well. Right. Which kind of makes sense, as I've kind of talked about. In history, a lot of times marriage did give you freedom, or at least more freedom than you previously had. And just out of curiosity, John, which idea did you kind of like? I know I haven't written much on each, and it was harder than I thought to write it fully for each idea, because I kind of think I was getting stuck with myself and kind of thinking too far along or not thinking far enough along, or just kind of overthinking things as a whole. Again, there's the S. Anyway. So I'm just interested to see kind of which idea, even though there's not so much writing there yet, and I wish I did have more. But I hope to have more, fingers crossed, next week and next Monday when I do the live stream, where you can actually kind of see the idea kind of thought out a little bit more than I have now, because it's just kind of bullet points. But anyway, names. In the medieval era, most people had only given a name, such as John, to help differentiate. Some were also known by a manor in which they resided. John became John of Cornwall Manor. This would would then be added to by things such as trade, Edward the metalsmith, Marcus the carpenter, or Jacob the miller. Over the century, there's turned into the last names of today. Just drop the D in this vein. If John had son Charles, he might be known as Charles John's son, also known as Charles Johnson. As John says, unfortunately, I wasn't in the room while you went through the ideas. Robert was here for a few minutes. Oh, that's fine. Are y'all still planning to do your generational gap today too? By the way, that's a plug. Yeah, John's from the Generational Gap, which is Freedom Scoop Network. And I believe their link for the charity stream is still up. I know it was through Ed's channel, Ed's Ward, or J.R. Edgar. You can find them on Twitter and all that. But Freedom Scoop is probably the easiest way to find Generational Gap and Ed. But I know that they had a link for, what was it called? What was your Rubicon? That's it. They had a link for Rubicon through, where you could donate to Rubicon or Robert. Ugh. What was the app called that you donated through? I can't think right now. Anyway, you would give. It was a charity stream that Generational Gap did, even though Ed hosted it due to technical problems. But I would highly suggest checking out Generational Gap, not just because they're part of Freedom Scoop and I'm part of Freedom Scoop, but also I really like their content. I'll be there at 8:30, so you should be there too. Anyway, but on all serious note, COVID has been extremely bad for the entire planet. Everybody's been affected by it in some way, and some people a lot more than others. So their charity stream and what they plan to do through donating to Rubicon through GoFundMe is a very good idea. And if you have any extra money, or you feel the need to help people who are in need, or people who are serving these people who are in need, they do have their link on their video and through Freedom Scoop for you to do so if you so choose to. And this was my last article I have for Peasant Life and for Life in the Medieval Times. And then I'm going to kind of run through my checklist for next week and what you should expect next week if you watch my video on Monday about my novel, as this is going to be an ongoing series. But I want, and again, I've kind of mentioned this, I want to make sure I do these videos to keep me accountable to my project. Although I like the project, I do need something to kind of push me sometimes. And this is very much allowing me to push myself and to get these deadlines done, because in general, I work better with deadlines than not. But, and I also hope that people who watch this enjoy the content and like it, and hope to hear more, because although it is my idea, I hope it's still interesting to those who watch. As I read from this article, when we enjoy entertainment or festivals that celebrate medieval life and times, it is life of royalty, traveling bards, monks of knights that are most often the focus of our attention. Few of us would want to celebrate the lives of peasants and serfs during the Middle Ages. That is good reason for that. There is little to celebrate about the harsh life poor people endured during this time period. For the poor, the Dark Ages really did not end the way that it did for the wealthy landowners, merchants, and high-ranking clergy during medieval times. It is not an exaggeration that the life of peasants was a constant struggle to survive. That struggle meant a daily life of hard work, harsh taxes, and a lifestyle that was filthy and full of dangers of all kinds for themselves and for their families. Because peasants were the very bottom rung of medieval society, They were under the harsh authority of just about every ring of society, or every rung of society. They had to work the land of the Lord who owned it, and then pay rent for working and living on that land as well. Peasants were required to swear an oath of allegiance to the Lord, and to violate that Lord would bring harsh, if not fatal, punishment. To fulfill that oath, peasants had to do just about every kind of difficult manual labor imaginable, including plowing the fields, planting and caring for crops, harvesting corn and other produce, storing it in barns, and cutting and storing wood for the winter for themselves and the lords who owned the land they lived on. So, actually, I just thought of something. I'll probably link I will link the GoFundMe to this video as well, so you don't have to go find it if you don't want to. But then again, I still suggest that you read or go to Freedom Scoop and check out the content and the people there. Anyway, as I read again, the level that those in power exploited the peasant class during the medieval times was truly appalling. In addition to coping with straggling and poverty, peasants had to pay stiff taxes to the Lord and to the church in the form of the tithe. Often peasants had no money for their tithes, so they paid them in the form of produce they grew on the land and rented from the lords. The Catholic Church realized such huge returns on tithes from the peasant class that they had to build massive barns to hold all the product that the peasants paid in. Daily life for peasants wasn't a struggle for the basics of health, water, and comfort. Their houses were called crunk houses. And they were made of very basic materials such as straw, mud, and manure. There was no glass or wood or doors and windows, so those openings were covered with curtains, which meant that the house was cold in the winter or stringently hot in the summertime. Almost an entire article is incorrect. Life for a peasant wasn't quite as bad as people think. Corn, that is an American crop. Did I say it wrong? I could have sworn I read corn. I don't know. Maybe I didn't read that. I lost my place in the article anyway. Yeah, I'm sure that this writer and this website, this artist. I'm sure this writer and this website is taking the drastic nature of a peasant, like the worst case scenario, and saying what it was like for the poor class of that worst case scenario. But most of the time in history, the average isn't as bad as what you think it is, because the average is average and not the worst and not the best. So in my story, I do plan to include the worst of the worst, but I don't want to overdo it and make it just extremely the worst of the worst, because it wasn't realistic to what actually happened. And I was going to say that, and I'm glad that John pointed that out, because when I did read this article, it did seem very harsh, and it was the first article I found when I was searching on Google, and that's why I searched a lot of other articles about it, because they wanted to keep my idea and my research fair, and I want to make sure that sites say the same thing so that I know it's true and not different every website, because obviously I want it to be based on the truth and not based on completely fantasy components. As John says, yeah, the article said they harvested corn. That was discovered until the end of the medieval era. That wasn't grown in Europe. Yeah, well, this article may be wrong in more than one ways. That's the painful part about research. And I was thinking of using Google Scholar and Jester and some other data research databases to read about more information in medieval times. And as I go through my checklist, you'll kind of know that my plan for next week into getting more research, because as I said probably 100 times already, I want it to be based off of what actually happened, but still have some components of fantasy and interest in that way. So that was kind of my research for what the average life of a peasant was. And so now we're going into my plan for next week. So when you go into this video, when you go next week at whatever time it might be, what should you expect to see, or what do I hope I will have done? Is kind of how I am approaching my checklist. So I want to research more on the poor. And I'm writing this down as I speak as well, because I did have some ideas as I kind of talked out loud. Because I find, and probably you find too, that when you kind of talk ideas out loud instead of just in your head and writing, that you come up with even more ideas or even more questions to what you read or what you have. So I want to research more in the poor. I want to research more castles. I want to research Catholicism. And I want to research the impact of it in the medieval times, because obviously I just had that one history article. I want to work on both ideas and at least have about 2 to 3 paragraphs for each, because I want to set realistic goals, because I don't want to rush this project, because I have all the time really in the war to make this novel. If it takes me 17 years to make a novel, then it takes me 17 years. I'm not like I'm trying to make this within a year because I have a publishing deadline or anything. This is just a project and a fun thing I have. So I don't want to rush, but I still want to make ideas that keep me thinking and challenge me so that I keep writing and keep going. So I want to work on both ideas. I want to research realistic castles as a whole, and not just more castles, but realistic ones. And I plan to watch videos as well, as I stumbled upon a good video about the Roman army and how big it was and how hard it would be to remake if it were to be done in today's times, taking in factors. As John says, Shadowversity has some excellent videos about medieval peasants. I'll have to check out those videos on Shadowversity. I know on the first stream, John was mentioning some things to look at, and he asked me if I knew of anything, and I mentioned Chad, and I know that John watches Shadowversity as well. And Shadowversity is awesome. I love him. I watch a lot of his videos. I haven't watched all of his videos by any means. He has a lot. But most recently, I've watched his castle ones, as I was kind of doing some castle research. But I'll have to check out his peasant videos and poor videos, as kind of that's how I'm starting both of my ideas, with idea one kind of being more on focus on the poor compared to the second idea. So those are kind of the ideas that I have going. And I also want to, on the Campfire program, fully finish my characters. Although I haven't fully thought out my story, I want to add a little bit more to each character so I can kind of have my mind thinking. Because the way I'm approaching this is, although I'm only writing this first chapter, I still need to look ahead just a little bit. I don't have to finish the whole story in my head or on paper or in idea by idea, but I at least need to look ahead enough to where I don't contradict myself in the next chapter or in the next paragraph even. And I want to flesh out these characters so that when I actually write the story, they're compelling and you would want to know more about them. So I'm going to keep going for a little bit longer in case you have any questions for me or any other sources I should check out, or anything I should add to my checklist. But I don't really know any more sites so far that I could show you that are pulled up and already read. And I don't really just want to randomly search websites and pull them up because I kind of want to know what the website talks about, so that we don't just read something over and over again, because that is rather boring. And Shadowversity is really cool. I watched his video when he had the 100-pound longbow, was it? And he was shooting across and trying to get accuracy and see how many arrows he could shoot, see how accurate he could be, see how far he could shoot, things of that nature. And he had someone question him about one of his bows in the pool range, and he kind of made a whole scene out of that question or that contradiction. In just the case if you're looking at the stream, obviously you probably wouldn't have made it this far for me to make this update, so I kind of should have made it at the start, but it just came to my mind now. I will be clipping the stream into smaller videos so that you can, so that when you come across the channel and you don't want to watch the entire stream, you will have smaller bits. But I would really like if you go to my live stream when I do my live stream and comment in the comment section, as it keeps it going and builds an audience, as I really do want to have an audience, as several other YouTubers and Freedom Scoop and other medias do. Especially with this project, because I do, in case if I know there's someone out there who's having the same project I'm having, or is trying to think of something else with the project they're having. It could be like wood making or carpentry or plumbing. I don't know who would have a plumbing hobby, but there's people out there would probably do. So I want to kind of keep this project going, and with your help, I feel that could be possible. And I feel like with each other, we could also help with other projects that aren't necessarily related to just writing and this novel. So I do think that it's a good idea to keep going, and I encourage you to watch the live streams. You don't have to watch all of the live stream. Just come to any bit you can for as long as you can when you have time. And definitely we have time during all this COVID mess what's going on, which I hope ends soon, but I don't think it will. Anyway, I'm kind of blabbering on now. But if you made it this far, you might as well leave a like. And if you haven't subscribed, I would enjoy if you would subscribe as well, as it keeps this channel going and keeps my motivation going. Catch you out next time, and thank you.